It was a regular Saturday afternoon. The sun was setting over our quiet suburban neighborhood, and everything seemed calm. My wife and I had just finished dinner and were sitting on the porch, enjoying a cool breeze. We had recently moved into the area, and we were still getting familiar with our neighbors and the rules of the community. Little did we know, this would be the evening that turned everything upside down. The neighborhood was the perfect place for us to settle in, a peaceful, quiet area with large yards, tree-lined streets, and friendly faces. It was the kind of neighborhood you could imagine yourself growing old in. We had spent the last few weeks unpacking boxes and figuring out where everything would go in our new home. It was still a work in progress, but we were content. On that particular Saturday, after a relaxing meal, we decided to unwind by sitting on our porch and watching the sunset. The sky was a beautiful orange-pink hue, and the soft evening breeze made everything feel peaceful. We chatted about our day and about how we were adjusting to the new area. It felt like a perfect evening, until the knock on the door shattered that calm. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just a neighbor stopping by to introduce themselves or perhaps a delivery person with a package. But when I opened the door, I was met with two men dressed in dark uniforms. Their presence felt official, but something about the situation didn't sit right. They weren't the police, and they weren't anyone I recognized from the neighborhood. The men introduced themselves as security officers from the Homeowners Association, or HOA, and immediately launched into a serious discussion. They were here to speak to my wife about some concerns they had regarding our property. The men's tone was businesslike, even stern, as they began talking about violations that had been reported about our home. My mind raced. What violations? We had barely made any changes to the house except for some minor cosmetic upgrades. But the officers didn't seem interested in hearing any explanations. They mentioned several complaints about how the property was being altered and how we were supposedly violating the HOA's strict guidelines on home exterior modifications. Now, I had read through the HOA rules before we moved in, and they seemed fairly straightforward. Nothing too restrictive, just basic guidelines on maintaining a certain aesthetic in the neighborhood. Nothing, at least, that should have caused any issues so early in our move. As my wife tried to explain that we hadn't done anything out of line, one of the security officers, a tall man with a very rigid posture, stepped forward and insisted that we needed to rectify the situation immediately. His words were becoming more forceful with each sentence, and I could feel the tension mounting. His partner stood off to the side, silent but watching, which made the entire situation feel even more uncomfortable. This was the first time we had encountered the HOA security in person, and we weren't quite sure how to navigate the situation. We were still new to the community, and we didn't want to cause any trouble. My wife, who was always calm under pressure, tried to de-escalate the situation by politely asking the officers what exactly we had done wrong and how we could address their concerns. But they didn't seem interested in solutions, they wanted compliance. The officer who had been speaking now raised his voice, telling my wife that they had already given us enough time and that they would have no choice but to take further action if the issues weren't resolved by the end of the week. His partner, who had been silent up until that point, suddenly spoke up. He mentioned the possibility of a fine or even further enforcement if we didn't comply. As the tension in the air thickened, I began to feel uncomfortable. This didn't seem like a friendly interaction at all. The two men weren't acting like they were here to help us resolve a misunderstanding. They were demanding that we follow their orders without room for discussion or negotiation. My wife remained calm, but I could tell that she was getting frustrated. She'd never been one to back down from confrontation, and I knew that this wouldn't end well if we didn't find a way to defuse the situation quickly. But what happened next was something neither of us could have predicted. Just as my wife tried to reason with the officers, the security guard closest to her suddenly made a move. In one swift motion, he reached for the gun holstered on his belt and drew it. My heart dropped as he pointed it at her. It all happened so fast that I couldn't react in time. The moment hung in the air, an overwhelming mix of shock and disbelief. I stared at the gun, then at my wife, who stood completely still. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, and didn't panic. Her training kicked in, she knew exactly how to handle situations like this. She had been through military training and had dealt with high-stress confrontations before. I, on the other hand, had no idea how to respond. All I could think was, this is my home. Why is this happening? It wasn't just an issue of rules and regulations anymore, this was about safety. In that moment, it became clear to me that these men didn't have the right to act in such an aggressive and threatening manner. And as much as we had tried to stay out of conflict with the HOA, it was now a fight for our peace of mind and our rights. Without wasting any time, the HOA officers began to tell my wife, who had just opened the door, that they had received multiple complaints about our property. Apparently, the HOA had a problem with some of the changes we had made to the house, nothing too drastic, just a few renovations to make the place more comfortable for us. But according to them, even small changes could set off alarms. They claimed our home was violating neighborhood aesthetics, a common complaint for any HOA, but this was the first time they decided to act so aggressively. At first, I thought it might have been a misunderstanding. After all, we had followed all the rules outlined in the HOA guidelines. The renovations were small, just a fresh coat of paint, a few new garden features, and replacing some old fixtures. Nothing too out of the ordinary or anything that would disrupt the flow of the community. Yet, the officers were acting like we had committed some grave offense. Their demeanor was not one of helpfulness but of authority. It was clear that they weren't here to help resolve a problem but to impose their will. The officers made it clear that they would be taking action against us for not complying with their regulations. The tone in their voices suggested that this wasn't going to be a simple warning. It was almost as if we had crossed some invisible line, and now we were going to pay the price. My wife, a firm believer in open communication, began to explain that the renovations were well within the guidelines provided to us. She politely asked them to specify which part of the changes they found problematic. However, the more she explained, the more agitated one of the security guards became. His calm and collected facade began to crack, and soon his tone shifted from stern to outright confrontational. He wasn't interested in listening. His voice grew louder, and his words sharper. He demanded that my wife step outside so they could talk face to face. This wasn't a casual request, it felt more like an order, a command that my wife was expected to follow without question. I could tell that the situation was escalating quickly, and I instinctively stepped forward, concerned that things might take a turn for the worse. But my wife, ever calm and poised, raised her hand slightly and told me to stay back. She looked at me with a reassuring glance, silently telling me that she could handle this. Reluctantly, I stepped back. I trusted her more than anything, and I knew that if anyone could defuse the situation, it was her. Still, the air around us felt thick with tension. The second officer stood in the background, silent and motionless, but his presence made it all the more unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to force us into submission. The lack of a reasonable explanation, combined with their aggressive tone, made it feel like they were abusing their position of authority. My wife stepped outside, keeping her posture straight and her expression calm, while I stayed just inside the door, watching the exchange. The officer's eyes locked onto hers as he continued his rant about our so-called violations. He didn't listen to her explanation. Instead, he repeatedly cut her off, insisting that we were in violation of HOA rules and that immediate action would be taken. His voice was becoming louder, and his body language was growing more hostile. This wasn't just about the renovations anymore, this was about control. I could see the frustration building on my wife's face. She was a trained professional who dealt with much higher stakes than this, and I knew she wasn't intimidated by the officer's posturing. But even she was beginning to feel the pressure mounting. The officer's demands became more intense, almost as if he was trying to provoke a reaction. His voice now carried a threatening edge, and the environment had shifted from one of a simple misunderstanding to something much more confrontational. At this point, I could see that the officer wasn't going to back down. He stepped closer to my wife, now demanding that she come to the back of the house so they could assess the renovations more thoroughly. This wasn't just a conversation anymore, it felt like an interrogation. It wasn't even about the changes we had made to the property, it was about power, dominance, and control. The officer was trying to push us into a corner, and I could feel the frustration mounting in the pit of my stomach. But my wife wasn't going to give in. She didn't raise her voice or challenge him directly. Instead, she did what she knew best. She remained calm and composed. She politely told the officer that they had no right to make demands of her and that she would only follow their requests if they could provide clear, valid reasons for their actions. But instead of listening, the officer's attitude grew even more aggressive. He leaned in closer, clearly trying to provoke her into a response. It was clear now that this wasn't about finding a resolution, it was about making us submit to their authority. I was ready to intervene at this point, but my wife's calm demeanor and clear-headed response had already done the job of diffusing the situation, at least temporarily. She took a step back, signaling that she wasn't going to engage further unless they could give her a reasonable explanation for their behavior. The officers exchanged glances, realizing that their tactics weren't working. In that brief moment, I thought the situation had calmed down, but what happened next took us all by surprise. The officer who had been more aggressive now reached for his holstered gun. The action was swift and unexpected, and in the blink of an eye, everything changed. At this point, I was still standing in the doorway, watching the interaction unfold. Things had already started to feel off, but I never imagined they would escalate the way they did. The officer's behavior had already been strange, but I didn't anticipate how quickly things would spiral out of control. I had always believed that confrontation could be handled through calm discussion, that people in positions of authority could be reasoned with, but I was quickly learning that this wasn't the case with these security officers. As my wife remained calm, trying her best to engage in a constructive conversation, the situation suddenly turned dangerous. Without any warning, one of the officers, the taller one who had been the most vocal, made a sudden movement. My body went tense as he reached for his holstered gun. It was a motion that felt unnatural, out of place in the conversation we were having. I froze for a split second, unsure of what I was seeing. Was this really happening? In a flash, the officer had drawn his weapon, holding it directly in front of him. My wife, standing mere feet away, was now the target of a loaded weapon in the middle of our front yard. The whole world seemed to pause in that moment. The air felt thick and heavy, and my heart was hammering in my chest. I couldn't understand how something so trivial as a neighborhood dispute had escalated to the point where my wife was facing a gun. My immediate reaction was a surge of panic. I wanted to shout, to run out and intervene, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. How could this be happening? Why would they pull a gun on my wife? I was paralyzed, unable to move or say anything. The only thing I could do was watch as my wife stood there, completely still, her eyes locked with the officers. Despite the weapon now aimed at her, my wife remained eerily calm. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't react with anger or fear. She stood as still as stone, assessing the situation, her body posture relaxed yet purposeful. She knew what to do in moments like this, and it was clear to me now just how much she had trained for situations like this. My wife wasn't just someone who knew how to defend herself in a physical confrontation, she was a Navy SEAL tactical trainer. She had spent years teaching military personnel how to stay calm under extreme pressure, how to think clearly when faced with life-or-death situations. In the face of a drawn gun, she wasn't intimidated. She wasn't frightened. Instead, she focused entirely on the officer, keeping her eyes trained on his every movement. It was like she was in complete control of the situation, despite the weapon pointed at her. I could see the officer's hand trembling slightly as he held the gun, unsure of himself. He didn't expect her to respond this way. He thought his weapon would intimidate her into submission, but instead, it was clear that the tables were turning. I stood in the doorway, helpless, but also filled with a sense of awe. I had always known my wife was tough, but I had never seen her handle a situation quite like this before. Her calmness in the face of danger was something that only someone with her experience could maintain. I knew she was fully aware of the risks, yet she didn't show even the slightest hint of fear. Her eyes were focused and unwavering, calculating every move the officer made. For a moment, the officer seemed to hesitate. His hand wavered slightly, as if uncertain whether to escalate the situation further. My wife spoke in a calm but firm tone, her words clear and measured. She told the officer to lower his weapon immediately, explaining that he was escalating the situation unnecessarily. She made it clear that she was not a threat, and that his actions were not only unjustified but reckless. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming rush of gratitude and pride for my wife. It was as if the world had slowed down, and everything in my mind centered on her ability to remain composed and control the situation. She wasn't just defending herself, she was de-escalating the entire scene, showing the officer that his threats held no power over her. The seconds felt like hours as the officer's gaze shifted between my wife and the gun in his hand. His partner stood to the side, silent and motionless, seemingly unsure of what to do. I could sense the tension in the air. The standoff felt like it could go either way. But as the seconds ticked by, the officer finally seemed to come to his senses. He slowly lowered his weapon, though his hand still trembled. The tension in the air didn't fully dissipate, but I could sense the change in the dynamic. My wife took a slow, deliberate step back, her eyes never leaving the officer. She had managed to defuse the situation without any violence, without any escalation. It was over. The officer, realizing the gravity of his actions, holstered his gun, though I could tell he was still shaken by the encounter. I was still processing what had just occurred, how things had gone from a simple HOA complaint to this incredibly dangerous situation. In that moment, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief that my wife had the training and the composure to handle such a critical moment. I didn't know what would have happened if she had reacted differently or if she had been less prepared. But thanks to her calmness and expertise, we had avoided a potentially catastrophic outcome. Still, the realization of just how close we came to something much worse hung in the air. How had it gotten to this point? How had the situation escalated from a simple conversation to a gun being drawn? That was the question that lingered in my mind as I watched the officers retreat, their authority shattered by the very person they had intended to intimidate. What the officers didn't know was that my wife wasn't just some ordinary person, they were dealing with a Navy SEAL tactical trainer. For years, she had trained Navy SEALs and other military personnel in high-stress situations, teaching them self-defense, close combat, and how to stay calm under pressure. She had been through some of the most intense military training and had seen the worst of the worst. This was a situation she was more than prepared for, and the officers didn't have a clue about the depth of her experience. Her background was a far cry from anything they could have imagined. Most people would have panicked or reacted aggressively when faced with such an extreme situation, especially when a gun is drawn in their direction. But my wife had been trained to keep a level head in the most volatile environments. She had taught countless men and women how to control their emotions in life-or-death situations. She had been in war zones, handled firearms in high-pressure scenarios, and had been through everything from close-quarters combat to survival situations. This wasn't a random confrontation for her, it was just another test of her ability to control the chaos. As the officer stood in front of her, gun raised and shaking, my wife's voice remained calm and collected. It was as if she were addressing a recruit in a training session rather than an officer holding a weapon. "Lower your weapon," she instructed in a firm yet steady voice, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. There was no fear in her tone, no panic, just an unwavering certainty. She didn't make a move to approach him, nor did she try to grab his weapon. She simply stood still, maintaining eye contact, her presence alone commanding control of the moment. The officer's hand trembled as he gripped the gun, his finger tight on the trigger. His face, previously stern and authoritative, was now riddled with confusion. He didn't know what to make of her. He had expected to intimidate her with his weapon, but now it was as though the tables had turned. The gun that he thought would give him control now seemed useless in the face of her calm, unshakable presence. My wife's training wasn't just about physical combat or handling weapons. It was about understanding the psychology of confrontation. She knew exactly how to de-escalate a situation like this, without ever lifting a finger. She understood the power of body language, the significance of maintaining eye contact, and how to read an opponent's reactions. She knew that a person in this kind of heightened state was just as much about mental fortitude as it was about physical power. And right now, she was in control of the mental battlefield. The officer seemed unsure of what to do next. He was clearly rattled, his body language betraying his nervousness. His grip on the gun tightened, and his gaze flicked between my wife and the weapon. He wasn't trained for this. He wasn't trained to deal with someone who wasn't intimidated by his weapon. He didn't have the training to handle someone who was not only unafraid but actively trying to disarm the situation with calm authority. "Put it down now," she repeated, this time with even more authority. Her words were simple, but there was a weight behind them. She wasn't asking him to lower his weapon, she was telling him. And somehow, that made all the difference. The officer's hesitation grew more pronounced. He was a man who had been given a gun to assert power, yet here was a woman, unarmed, standing her ground with nothing but sheer control. I watched the officer's movements closely, expecting him to snap at any moment. But what happened next was something I hadn't expected. The officer's hand, trembling ever so slightly, began to lower the weapon. It was slow at first, his eyes never leaving my wife's. The tension was still palpable in the air, but it was no longer one-sided. For the first time, he was unsure of himself, unsure whether he should continue to assert his authority or step back. When the gun was finally lowered, my wife exhaled softly, the slightest of nods acknowledging that he had made the right choice. But she didn't let her guard down. She kept a careful eye on him, her awareness of the situation still sharp. There was no room for complacency. She knew that this moment wasn't over yet. But for now, the immediate danger had passed. The officer's face flushed with embarrassment. He had overstepped in a way that could have had serious consequences, and it was clear he knew it. My wife's ability to control the situation without resorting to violence or anger had diffused the situation in a way he couldn't have anticipated. His bravado, his weapon, and his aggression had all faltered in the face of her calm determination. At this point, his partner, who had been standing silently to the side, began to speak up, his voice unsure. We're just trying to do our job," he stammered. But it was too late for excuses. The damage had already been done. My wife's response had already shifted the balance of power in the conversation. She was not only teaching the officers a lesson about the consequences of their actions, but also about what it truly means to stand your ground when pushed into a corner. As the first officer holstered his gun, I finally moved forward, standing beside my wife. We were both still tense, but the worst was behind us. The officer had realized that his attempt to control the situation with a weapon had failed. What he hadn't realized was that by underestimating my wife's training and poise, he had unwittingly placed himself in a far more dangerous situation, one that he never expected. Before I could even blink, my wife had expertly disarmed the officer. It happened so quickly, so fluidly, that it was hard to process at first. One moment, the officer had his gun aimed at her, and the next, she had it in her hand, its barrel pointed safely toward the ground. It was almost like she had anticipated his every move, and with the precision of a trained professional, she disarmed him without causing any harm. Her movements were so smooth, so calculated, it looked effortless. It was over in seconds, but those seconds felt like an eternity. I was still standing there in shock, processing what I had just witnessed. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the adrenaline still surged through my veins. But what struck me the most in that moment was how calm my wife was. There was no rush in her movements, no sign of panic or fear. She had handled this situation with the same poise and focus she'd used countless times during her training sessions with the Navy SEALs. This wasn't just a defensive move, this was a calculated, controlled disarm that showed the officer just how out of his depth he was. The officer stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His gun, which had once been the instrument of his perceived authority, was now in the hands of someone who had completely neutralized the threat without a single shot being fired. The second officer, who had been standing in the background, was equally paralyzed by the turn of events. His eyes widened in disbelief as he watched his partner's weapon being taken away from him with such ease. Neither of them knew how to react. They were trained to wield power, to use force when necessary, but in this moment, they were powerless. As my wife stood there holding the gun, her posture relaxed but alert, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The fear that had gripped me when I saw the gun pointed at her was slowly melting away. My wife, with her years of training and her unshakable calm, had taken control of the situation and diffused it completely. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make any threats, and didn't need to resort to aggression. She had simply shown them that she was not someone to be intimidated. What happened next was almost surreal. The officers, who had been so sure of their authority moments before, now found themselves at a loss for what to do. The first officer, still in shock, looked down at his empty holster, then back at my wife, who was now standing with his gun in her hands. He clearly didn't know how to recover from this. The other officer was silent, still processing the situation, trying to figure out how it had slipped from his control so quickly. My wife, ever the professional, didn't let the situation linger. She turned the gun over in her hands, ensuring it was safe, before calmly holding it out to the officer. "Take it," she said in a tone that was firm but devoid of malice. There was no need to threaten him or make a scene. She had already proven her point. The officer's authority had crumbled, and now they were left with the very weapon they had once intended to use to assert dominance. The first officer hesitated but finally took the gun back from her, his hand shaking slightly as he reholstered it. The other officer, still unsure of what had just transpired, seemed to be weighing his options. He glanced at his partner and then back at my wife, who was standing there, completely composed and in control. It was like they were both trying to come to terms with the fact that they had just been outclassed by someone who had done nothing more than remain calm and assess the situation. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for my wife. She had handled everything with the precision and grace of a seasoned professional. In the face of danger, she hadn't flinched. She hadn't panicked. Instead, she had turned a potentially deadly situation into a lesson in control and composure. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, to be aggressive, or to threaten anyone. She had simply taken the weapon away from the officer, proving that strength wasn't always about force, it was about staying calm and using the right tactics at the right moment. As the officers stood there, speechless and unsure of their next move, I realized just how much they had underestimated my wife. They had assumed that they were the ones with power, that they could control the situation with a weapon. But they hadn't accounted for the fact that my wife had the training to handle not just physical threats, but psychological ones as well. In that moment, she had proven that she was the one in control, and the officers, who had thought they were in charge, had become the ones who were out of their element. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but eventually, the officers backed down. They muttered some words about reporting the incident to the HOA and left without making any further threats. But the damage had already been done. The balance of power had shifted, and they knew it. My wife had shown them that her training, her expertise, and her ability to remain calm under pressure were more powerful than any weapon they could wield. As they walked away, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude and admiration for my wife. Not only had she kept us safe, but she had done so in a way that left no room for escalation. It was a perfect example of how confidence, control, and the right training could turn a potentially dangerous situation into a complete non-event. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened next, we were both going to be just fine. I quickly called the police to report what had just transpired. My hand was shaking as I dialed, but I knew I had to do something. The situation had escalated far beyond anything that should have happened, and I couldn't just let it go. The officers needed to be held accountable for pulling a weapon on my wife, and the HOA's so-called security guards needed to face the consequences of their reckless actions. As the call connected, I gave the dispatcher a brief but clear account of the events, mentioning the drawn gun, the threat, and how my wife had safely handled the situation. The dispatcher assured me that officers would be on their way. While I waited, I could still feel the adrenaline pumping through my body. My wife, standing beside me, was still calm, but I knew she was processing everything that had just happened. It wasn't every day that someone drew a weapon on you in your own yard. I could see the emotions starting to settle in, relief that things hadn't gotten worse, but also anger at how the situation had unfolded in the first place. We had simply tried to live peacefully in our new home, but instead, we were faced with an overzealous HOA enforcement team and their misguided sense of power. Within minutes, the police arrived, and it was like a switch flipped. They immediately took control of the situation, asking for statements and assessing what had happened. The officers who had been called to the scene quickly sized up the situation. They weren't buying the story the HOA security guards were selling. As they took the two guards aside for questioning, it became evident that these so-called security officers were woefully unprepared for what had just occurred. It didn't take long for the police to realize that they weren't dealing with trained professionals. In fact, these two men weren't even certified security guards, they were just hired by the HOA to enforce neighborhood rules. The first officer on the scene asked the guards for their credentials, and there was an awkward silence. The guards fumbled for their IDs, and their explanations didn't hold up. They weren't licensed to carry firearms or to act as armed security. They were simply individuals hired by the HOA to patrol the neighborhood, and they had overstepped their boundaries in a catastrophic way. The police officers' expressions shifted from neutral to visibly concerned as they realized just how dangerously unqualified these men were for the role they had been given. The reality of the situation hit me hard. The HOA had hired these untrained, uncertified individuals to enforce their rules, and now that reckless decision had almost led to violence. The men who were supposed to be keeping the peace had caused a potential crisis. My wife, the calm, trained professional, had been the one to defuse the situation, but it was clear that these guards had no idea how to handle any situation beyond the most basic level. They had been handed weapons and authority without the necessary skills to wield them responsibly, and it almost cost us dearly. The police officers pulled the HOA security guards aside for a more in-depth questioning, away from us. I could hear snippets of their conversation, but the real substance of it was being exchanged out of earshot. However, it was obvious that the police were making it clear to the guards that their actions had been highly inappropriate and dangerous. They asked about their training and certifications, to which the guards had little to say. In fact, one of them seemed nervous, stammering in his responses as he tried to justify his actions. The other remained eerily silent, looking anywhere but directly at the officers. As the police officers continued to question them, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice wash over me. These guards, who had thought they could impose their will on us with intimidation, were now the ones under scrutiny. I was filled with a deep sense of vindication. My wife had disarmed a potentially dangerous situation, but these so-called security officers were the real threat. They had no business carrying weapons, and their lack of training had put us, as well as the entire neighborhood, in harm's way. The police took the guards' statements and then informed them that they would be filing a report about the incident. They were quick to make it clear that their conduct was being investigated and that there would be consequences for their actions. While no immediate charges were filed that day, the officers made it clear that the HOA would be informed of the guards' behavior and further investigation would take place. At that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The police had taken the right steps to ensure that those responsible were held accountable. It was one thing for an HOA to enforce community rules, but it was entirely another for them to put residents at risk with unqualified, armed security personnel. The incident could have ended very differently if not for my wife's training and quick thinking. As the police wrapped up their investigation and left, I turned to my wife, grateful for her calm under pressure. She had handled the situation with the grace and precision of someone who had been through much worse. I knew that we had avoided a far worse outcome, and for that, I was thankful. We had done the right thing by calling the authorities, and the situation had been diffused in the best way possible, despite the shocking events that had unfolded on our doorstep. But I also knew this wasn't over. The HOA would have to answer for their poor decision in hiring these unqualified security guards, and I intended to make sure that no one else in the neighborhood would ever have to face a situation like this again. This was a fight for more than just our peace of mind. It was a fight to make sure the safety of everyone in the community was protected, regardless of who they were or what rules they followed. After a long evening of questioning and statements, the HOA security officers were detained for further investigation. The atmosphere was tense as the police officers wrapped up their interviews with the guards. As the minutes passed, it became clear that the guards had acted far beyond their scope of authority. The situation was more than just an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a reckless and irresponsible series of events that had put everyone involved at great risk. The more the officers delved into the guards' actions, the more it became evident that they had been grossly unqualified for the task at hand. They were supposed to be enforcing neighborhood guidelines, not putting residents' safety in jeopardy by drawing a weapon without cause. The police quickly gathered all the necessary evidence, and soon it was revealed that these men had no real training in handling high-stress confrontations or in dealing with firearms. Their only qualification seemed to be that they had been hired by the HOA to patrol the area and enforce minor regulations. No weapons training, no security certifications, nothing that should have warranted them carrying firearms in the first place. As the police filed their report, the gravity of the situation settled in. These two men had no business carrying weapons or making life-altering decisions for homeowners. What they had done was not just a simple mistake, it was a clear case of overreach that could have turned disastrous. The HOA itself was forced to issue an official apology to us. It was not something they wanted to do, but there was no denying the facts. They had overstepped their boundaries in the most dangerous way. In their attempt to enforce rules they deemed necessary for the neighborhood, they had brought an entirely new level of danger to the doorstep of one of their residents. The HOA was now facing scrutiny from both the police and the community. What had started as a minor renovation dispute had escalated into something much more serious, an infringement on our rights and personal safety. In the wake of the incident, the HOA issued a public statement acknowledging their failure to vet the security officers properly. They promised to review their hiring practices and security protocols to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. The guards were reprimanded, though their futures within the HOA organization were left unclear. Their actions had not only jeopardized my wife's safety but also left the entire neighborhood questioning whether the HOA could really be trusted to enforce rules without crossing dangerous lines. The HOA's apology was, of course, a formality. But the fact that they had to issue it at all spoke volumes. We were able to continue living in our home without further interference from the HOA, but the aftermath of the ordeal left us shaken. What should have been a peaceful neighborhood experience had turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. It's one thing to deal with HOA rules and regulations and work within the boundaries they set, but it's an entirely different thing when you're faced with threats and aggression on your own property. There's something unnerving about the idea that someone can come into your home and try to control your life in such a blatant and overbearing way. It was a stark reminder that sometimes, even in a seemingly tranquil suburban neighborhood, things can spiral out of control when authority is abused. The situation had left a mark on us, particularly my wife. Although she handled the situation with unparalleled calm and precision, the memory of what had happened lingered. She had saved us from what could have been a much worse outcome, but it was impossible to forget how close we had come to an entirely different reality. The police, the HOA, and the guards, none of them had anticipated the outcome of this confrontation. They had underestimated my wife's ability to control the situation, and it was this very control that had saved us. In the end, we learned a valuable lesson. While it's important to follow rules and regulations, there are times when you must stand up for yourself and protect what is rightfully yours. This experience reinforced the idea that knowing how to defend yourself, both physically and mentally, is sometimes the only way to ensure your safety and peace of mind. My wife's training and experience had been the key factor in diffusing the situation before it could escalate any further. Her ability to stay composed, think clearly under pressure, and take control of the situation was nothing short of heroic. We left the ordeal with a deeper understanding of the lengths people would go to enforce power and control, but we also left with a newfound respect for the importance of self-defense and the ability to stand firm when faced with adversity. This incident had shown us that sometimes, the ability to defend yourself goes far beyond physical strength. It's about mental fortitude and knowing how to protect those you love from harm, no matter the circumstances. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories about crazy HOA drama and how to protect yourself in unpredictable situations. Stay tuned for more stories where real-life challenges teach us invaluable lessons about standing our ground and navigating the unexpected.